Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Matt Gayer, Executive Director at Spur Local. We're talking about change management today and how to manage change for your teams and your organization. We're going to give folks just one more minute here to hop on, just one more minute, then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of y'all that just hopped on, my name is Matt Gayer. I'm the Executive Director at Spur Local. Talking about managing change today and how to do change management for your teams and your organizations. Couple of things to note. You should be able to see our slides right now, hear our audio. If you have issues with either today, just let us know. We'll try to address those as quickly as we can. We will send out a copy of the slides and recording. You will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar, along with a short evaluation, less than a minute long. We really appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. And if you have questions throughout the day, we're going to be talking about some frameworks, some specific kind of tips and strategies for dealing with change at your organization. If you have questions about how to apply that, questions for your specific team, feel free to put those in the question box or chat at any time. I'll answer those as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. So when we think about managing change, the biggest thing we say is that even if your organization's pretty steady, the work's pretty steady, right? There's no kind of big hiring or shifting or financial challenge or programmatic shift. Uh, every organization still has change as a regular thing, right? We're always kind of changing, adapting, especially as small and medium-sized organizations. So it's something we have to address, have to think about, and if we're not managing it, it's going to have some impacts that can really be really challenging for the organization. So, a couple of things for context before we dive into those tips today. There's a lot of change going on in the nonprofit space right now. That has probably always been true. We could have done this webinar and said that 20, 30 years ago. But the pace of change and the volume of it does seem to be new, especially in its kind of sustained rate for especially community-based nonprofits. So we obviously have shifts in giving, right? And kind of individual giving, individual volunteering being down, who's giving being different, the cost we face, right, with inflation, the business models that work today, increasing emphasis on earned revenue for nonprofits, staffing demands, hiring needs, hybrid work, right, all that continues to evolve. The community needs, the places we're working in, right? What they need and kind of their often their need for kind of comprehensive support more than kind of single issue based support continues to evolve and make our work more complex than it was before. Government funding, right? Communication channels, social media, and that list could be a lot longer. But just to highlight something we all probably know and feel is that there's a lot of change going on, right? And not all those changes externally are impacting us internally, but at least some of those, I would venture a guess, are impacting how you do your work, what you're doing, how you're thinking about staffing. So there's a lot of change out there in this kind of shifting environment, both because of that and also because of other factors, there's still a high level of concern about burnout and exhaustion and tiredness for staff and for leaders. I will say we've seen this get a lot better than it was a couple years ago, both for leaders and staff. For staff, especially, things are really in a pretty good place right now. We see a lot of times with engagement, but also we know it only takes a little bit, right, of added stress or a little bit of not actively managing that for teams to get back to a really stressed place. given the volume of work and the volume of change happening. And leaders, while doing better, are still really in an active crisis in a lot of ways. Half of local executive directors, given our surveys, feel a sense of burnout. So that means they either have been recently, feel like they're going to be, or are currently burnt out. And over half of executive directors in a national study are actively concerned about their team's stress and burnout. And again, teams are actually doing pretty well, but leaders of those teams, managers of those teams, understand it takes active work and active involvement to keep those teams doing well. And the phrase we hear a handful of times, and also when we say it really resonates with folks, it's like sprinting a marathon, right? Folks feel like they're going kind of full speed, and there's not that off ramp to slow down for a bit. That's what we'll talk a little bit today about, that pacing. We can't stop the running necessarily, but we can hopefully change the pace a little bit, create some pockets of rest, make sure our teams stay engaged. And then finally, just highlighting something that, again, probably always true, but at least feels more true now than it has been in the past, is that folks show up at work with their whole selves, right? And if they are having stress in their personal life or family life, or taking care of an aging parent, or X, Y, or Z kind of going on, that's going to show up in some way in their work as well, right? And we need to recognize that and know that this is a stressful time for folks. There's a lot of social issues they might be concerned and caring about. There's a lot of global issues they might be paying attention to. And how are we letting people show up with their full selves, and how is that impacting the rate of change and size of change projects that we're taking on? So we'll go through 5 tips today about strategies to kind of manage change again, and why we say kind of manage, right? Why I think that's a good word for it is that change is going to happen. Change is inevitably going to happen to our teams, small or large, over time. And what we can do, though, is actively manage that, right? And try to own that process instead of that process owning us. So the first tip here is really, really kind of recognizing that not all change is the same, right? Us, kind of updating a small system versus adding a new program versus hiring 3 new people, all very different, the impacts of that on the organization. So it's important that when we're thinking about the changes facing the organization, or the changes we're thinking about making, right? Some change is kind of forced upon us, some change we actively pursue, that we're mapping it to this 2x2 that I'll go through here in a second to help us think about where those changes fall. So how we think about change, the 2 big things to kind of define it are: how hard is it going to be to do, right? Is this going to be really difficult to implement? Is this going to be super easy to implement? And then what impact is it going to make, right? Is when this change is fully implemented, is a lot of things going to be different? Are our clients going to be better served? Are our staff going to have a different work culture or work environment or work reality? Or is it not really going to make a big difference, but we still have to do it, right? So impact and effort are really what we're comparing here. So starting in the top left corner here, changes that are high impact, so they're going to make a big difference but low effort. These are easy wins, right? There's probably not a ton of these, right? If there were a bunch of these laying around for you, you probably would already be doing them. But there are definitely things that fall in this bucket, right? So a lot of times this could be updating a technology, right? Or adding a new technology service at the organization that makes something about staff life a lot simpler or a lot quicker. It might be updating process for our programs, right? It might be shifting the type of fundraising event we do. Things that require a small amount of effort because it's making it easier for us, but the impact is going to be really big. Again, there's not going to be a ton of these for us, but as we find these can be really great to pair with some of these harder things we'll talk about here in a second. One thing about change management that we look at is, if I have 2 or 3 or 4 big projects that are difficult to do, that are going to take, a year plus to kind of get done fully, can I put in some smaller projects along the way that the team can celebrate a victory, right? A lot of this is about how do I get some wins along these kind of longer term projects so the staff feels like there's progress. So we're thinking about easy wins there. Bottom left, these are things that are low effort, low impact. They're not going to really move the needle. They're not really challenging. These are things that, again, if we don't have anything in the easy win bucket, these filler kind of changes, goals, can be helpful because again, they're easy to get done, and we want something on this easy side to be happening on a regular basis so it feels like progress is being made, even if that progress isn't really going to lead to a huge impact. Ideally, it's in the easy win bucket, right? And there's a big impact to it. But if we don't have anything in that bucket, these filler goals, this could be something like, reorganizing our digital file system if that's something the staff are complaining about, or really kind of removing some pain points for staff on some smaller issues, again, so they feel some progress being made there. On the high effort side, I'll start at the bottom. High effort, low impact. You might be asking kind of why you would ever do this. These are things that are either maybe regulatory required, right? We have to do this based on external policies, laws, or shifts in the system, right? That means we have to do something different. Or they're things that we're required to do, right? We have a donor database that's aging. We need to switch it. It's going to be a lot of work. It's not really going to make a big difference, but we do have to get it done, right? So there's going to be some rainy day items there. We're going to try to spread those out. These are usually not very energizing for staff, so we don't want to take on too many of these at the same time. And then finally, and the biggest one, is really thinking about strategic changes. We really should try to hold ourselves to only doing one or two of these actively at a time. So even if you have a strategic plan, right, with 4 or 5 goals in it, they all feel like they're strategic, possibly. Across a 3-year plan, we're not going to want to do all 5 of those goals simultaneously right on day one, right? We want to stagger kind of which ones we're actively pursuing and actively diving into. Some of the questions here on the side, for time, I won't go through all of them, but just help to decide kind of how high of an effort, how high of an impact is this going to be. So as we sort these, we again can pick a couple strategic ones to focus on, but making sure we don't take 4 of those that are going to be really high effort, difficult things and put on staff at the same time. Our next step here is really thinking about it, and the next 2 we'll kind of dive into this a little bit, is that a lot of this gets down to who's going to be impacted by the changes we're making, right? So we're making a change to program A that may or may not really impact my development director, right? It will secondarily. They'll have to update their fundraising pitch, right, or grant, or get some new data or something, but it probably isn't going to cause a huge shift to their day-to-day workflow. Whereas for the staff within program A, their work's going to be completely different, possibly, right, for a few months or for a year. So it's important to think about the fact that changes don't impact everyone at the organization equally. And where is that change kind of impacting, and kind of mapping that out a little bit. So first, we want to think about, and most importantly, who's being directly impacted by the change. So again, we're shifting program A staff, right? We want to make sure we're engaging these stakeholders early and often, right? We want to make sure they know that this is on the radar, right? Hey, we're thinking about making a change to our after-school program. Want to, bring you in early, kind of get your thoughts on that. Want to frequently communicate with them because they're going to have a lot of stress, right, about what that shift to my day-to-day looks like. And then let them know that when we roll out whatever change is eventually agreed upon, that hopefully they're involved in the making of, there's going to be ongoing support and feedback, right? They're not just going to have it and then have to run with it. We're going to support them during it. There's going to be places they can ask questions, places they get feedback about what's not working. And really our goal here is engaging early and often. The other thing we'll talk about in the next slide, but I just want to preview here, is want to make sure that a lot of times in organizations, especially small staff, right? So if you have kind of 15 or less, 20 or less staff, a lot of times, 2 or 3 of the strategic changes all impact the same person, right? We make 3 strategic changes to our program, and our program director is managing 3 strategic changes simultaneously. That's where we start seeing burnout really come in from that person and then radiates out to others. So we want to really make sure that as we're mapping this as well, if we have a direct stakeholder that their name is showing up on 2, 3, 4 of the strategic priorities for the organization, we're thinking about how to delay some of those, shift some of those around so that one person is not at the center of everything we're doing. Second group of staff or kind of stakeholders to think about are those that are really in this responsible bucket. So these are going to be folks that are ultimately kind of in charge of ensuring success. they're often going to be kind of the folks kind of both doing it, but then also measuring it. For those of us with small teams, the direct responsible might be the same person, right? We may not have kind of a program director, then also a junior program staff. We may just have a program staff person, right? And that's the only person we have. But if we do have a couple staff here, some of the more frontline staff might fall in this kind of responsible bucket. Ultimately, we really want to make sure these folks feel empowered, so we're going to inform them regularly and update them regularly, and then also give a way for feedback, right? So they're going to have regular check-ins with their manager or with management, and we want to make sure that a little less back and forth early on than we are with the direct stakeholders, but that they're still getting information on a regular basis and they don't feel like they're finding out about things at the last second. Third group, these are indirect staff, indirect stakeholders. Why we care about this group, right? So again, in the previous example, we're talking about, we're changing a program. Why would my development director or ops manager or something like that really care about that other than, they need to write differently or think differently about it? Is that when change is happening at the organization, even if they're not a part of it, it's still causing stress, right? So for your team, knowing that something is changing is causing everyone some secondary stress, basically. That's either coming from the staff who are being directly impacted, talking about it, and that's causing stress, or them just knowing something is going to be different is causing them some anxiety there. So I want to make sure that staff are not unaware, kind of siloed off from this. We don't need to burden them with all the details. We do want to make sure that they know they're not directly involved. This isn't on their plate, but here is what's happening. And if there's any kind of need to train them or educate them more deeply about it, that's occurring at the appropriate time. But again, letting them know, like, hey, this isn't impacting you. I do want you to know about it because it's impacting the organization. What questions do you have? That's going to help them not take on some of that kind of secondhand anxiety and secondhand stress. And then finally, when we think about those that are invested, these are less likely to be staff and more like donors or clients, folks that are ultimately going to be impacted by either this is something they support that's different now, or this is something that they're served by that's different now. Want to give them an early heads up, right? The big thing with this group is we just want to avoid surprises. Ideally, especially with clients, community members, we're getting some feedback ahead of time with them. But especially if it's a smaller change, we may not always do that. The biggest thing is we just don't want anyone to ever be surprised. I don't want a donor come back, make their gift, and then a month later say, like, I didn't know you canceled program A. That's the program I loved, right? Like, we want to make sure folks know what's going on, what's shifting, what's changing as appropriate. The third tip, and someone asked if we had worksheets or tools for these. Not for all these, but I will say you can almost use these slides as a de facto tool, right? So for the first one around kind of prioritizing changes, you can kind of take that 2x2, draw that yourself, right, and map things to it. For the last one about stakeholders, using that to make 4 columns and kind of mapping out your staff given a specific change is actually something I really recommend to folks to do. To kind of just in an Excel, put the change at the top of the worksheet, right, and then make those different columns and think about who falls where in terms of direct or indirect or invested. Great question, though. And we'll look at that, at adding some tools across the winter and having those ready in the spring. All right, the third tip here is thinking about the individuals themselves, right? So again, if the last one was really about thinking about individuals at kind of that macro level of where do they fall in these different buckets and how do I need to engage with them during the change, this is really thinking about the individual as an individual, right? As a person. The first thing we're thinking about here is the pace of change. Has this person, that's going to be a direct stakeholder for a change. We're changing our finance system, so my director of operations or director of finance. Changing a program by program director. What other changes have they been involved in the past year, right? And how directly? So even if they're only doing one change at a time, did they just finish redoing our donor database, and now I'm asking them to redo our grant writing process, right? And it's only been a week. A lot of times we see, again, that sprinting a marathon, if there's a little break, and instead of a marathon, it's 4 6-mile runs, that's a lot easier for staff to handle, right, than trying to do the whole thing at the same time. So thinking about how can we build in some breaks and how can I make sure they're not running two races at the same time. That change, saturation, and burnout, that really is caused by either we're doing multiple strategic things at the same time and folks feel overwhelmed. We may not be doing anything big, so we think it's okay to do a bunch of small stuff. That's where people start feeling, even though there's not actually a lot shifting or a lot of work to do, they start just feeling like everything's changing, right? This can be a frustrating one for managers or leaders because they feel like not a lot's going on. It's pretty chill, right? It's pretty laid back. There's just a couple of things kind of shifting that we're doing. But for staff, that can often feel like, okay, we're changing 6 small things. Everything's changing. Even though it's not necessarily reality, that's the emotional feeling from that, right? So I want to make sure we're not tackling a bunch of little things also, right? And we're still kind of thinking about the pace of that. And then finally, it's that history of change, right? So if after every change we start another one, if it's always more, grow, progress, folks then expect to be exhausted. And once that exhaustion expectation kicks in, even if you were to take a break, it gets harder and harder for them to feel like they can ever rest because they feel like the next day they might come in and something else is shifting. A couple ways to combat that. One is making sure there's a really long on ramp for when changes start and getting that habit. So people know nothing big is going to shift until they start asking me about my thoughts on it. And when they do, it's still going to be a couple months before it begins, right? So I'm building on an on ramp so they know I'm not going to just tell them on a Friday, hey, everything's going to be different on Monday. The other thing there, again, is building in some breaks so we're not always changing and trying to build in a little bit of rest in between those. The other thing we want to think about, the two things that lead to this kind of feeling of overwhelm when it comes to change. One is the pace of change itself, but the other is the level of effort required, right? We want to try to limit the changes we're making at the organization to not adding more than 4 to 6 hours weekly of new work, right? Now, if we're launching a whole new program, hiring new staff, right, that's totally different. But if I'm shifting my current program to be a little more intensive, and adding on some work as a result of it, I want to try to cap that around like that again, kind of 10 to 15% of their week, right? 4 to 6 hours. If it is going to be more than that, we need to find a way to dramatically offload what they're currently doing, right? So if I'm asking my finance director, hey, I need to redo our entire accounting system, right? And it's going to add about 10 to 15 hours a week for you for the next few months, right, to get that done or something, donor database, whatever it might be, launch a new program. I need to take something off their plate, right? If it's 4 to 6 hours and there's only one thing at a time we're doing there, right? We're not doing that 3 different times at the same time. But it's 4 to 6 hours total of change work. We often can kind of move a couple little things around to fit that in. If it's more than that, we really need to think about how we're clearing space for them. Our fourth tip, this is, always one of the most important pieces about change management is just how we're talking about it. Making sure we're not overwhelming them, right? Mapping the stakeholders, thinking about the individuals, all really important. But if we're not communicating it well, it's going to feel overwhelming for people. And the biggest thing we're trying to communicate here with change management is all the things that aren't changing. And what I mean by that is that, again, often for staff, because they have changes going on in their personal life, we've had changes before at the organization, we're making changes now. All of a sudden, it just starts feeling like everything's spinning out of control a little bit. What we can do as managers and leaders there is really try to remind folks that, yes, we're changing our program recruitment process, but 95% of what we do is staying exactly the same, right? Nothing else is shifting, but this is what's going to change. So trying to be clear about what's known right now, right? Here's the things that aren't changing. Here's what's changing, and here's going to be the work we know of and the impact we know of from that change, right? And starting from that place of calm, starting from that place of kind of continuity. Then we want to be honest about the things we don't know, right? Hey, we're doing this program recruitment shift. We're not sure exactly how much more time this is going to add yet, right? Or we don't know if we're going to be successful in getting X, Y, or Z audience to participate in the program, but we're going to try, right? This is how long we're going to try for before we kind of pivot or are open to pivoting from it, right? So trying to be open about what we don't know there, not trying to act like we have everything perfectly understood, because that's not going to come off as authentic to staff, and make sure they know there's going to be opportunities for feedback and opportunities for flexibility there. And then finally, we want to make sure folks know about next steps, right? If we just say, hey, we're changing program A, that leaves us with a lot of anxiety about like, oh my God, like by tomorrow, like what are we doing next, right? What's needed of us as a team. So I want to make sure we end with, hey, here's the next couple things we're doing, right? Creating a sense of action. There's some progress. I want to make sure even within those bigger strategic changes, there's some small wins and milestones we can celebrate. Celebrate those as they come up. Celebration is key to having people kind of feel like the change is making progress. And then make sure that other stakeholders who aren't involved have some takeaway, right? Even if that's simply, we encourage you to check in on your program colleagues as they kind of embark on this journey, right? But giving them something to do so they don't feel like this is all happening and they're being kind of left outside of it. And then finally, last tip, and then we'll pause for questions folks have here in the last couple minutes, is how we kind of manage during the active period of change, right? So we're putting in a change process at the organization. What are we doing here? A big part of this is getting feedback, right? We're asking for feedback routinely. One question I always get is, what does this look like with a small team, right? I have 4 staff, 5 staff. I can't really put a suggestion box out there. People are going to feel like it's a little more personal than that. Go ahead and schedule some one-on-ones, right? And really let folks know you're looking to learn during this. You're looking to get feedback. That's a critical part of a change being successful. Just because we have a plan doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly. So that feedback is really important there. If we do have a larger team than 5 or so, having a passive channel as well, whether that is that question box or suggestion box, or if that's a anonymous email or a survey they can submit to. Sometimes folks are just going to feel more comfortable doing that. And having that passive channel, even though we don't usually see it get used often at small organizations, builds a sense of trust, right? Lets folks know that you're open to honestly hearing what they're thinking about. And then make sure we praise feedback, right? So as people are having feedback or questions, celebrate those and celebrate those publicly when appropriate, to make sure folks know we're not just open to feedback, we want feedback on this process. Second, we want to set realistic expectations. And something we see often in the nonprofit space that's unique than the for-profit space sometimes, is that a lot of times those unrealistic expectations are not set by the leaders, but they're set by the staff, right? The staff are so passionate about what they're doing. They're like, hey, we're going to grow this by 200% in a month or something, right? And sometimes our job then as manager or leader is to slow that process a little bit, right? Saying that, if we happen to get there, that's great, but that's not what I'm expecting of it, right? So protecting them from them a little bit. We also want to make sure we're obviously not setting unrealistic expectations there. Milestones are really your biggest friend here. We want to set those milestones, be able to celebrate, and be able to get a sense of if we're staying on track or not. And then finally, the last piece, why change doesn't happen often. What goes wrong? It's usually some type of hurdle, right? It's not really staff always being reticent to change, but it's either them lacking the knowledge or confidence to do it, them lacking the resources or time, or them lacking the actual or perceived kind of empowerment or power to do it. So trying to surface those through feedback and then eliminate those hurdles as possible. So here's a couple quick next steps, but I want to pause there and make sure we have some time for questions from folks. Again, we'll try to build out some tools for this, but also these slides are meant to be hopefully helpful starting places to use to map some of your comms, some of your stakeholders, and some of your changes as you're going through this. So any questions folks have for a wrap up today? Someone asked, what if your organization has to take on 2 or 3 strategic things at once due to either kind of a short-term challenge or regulation change or community need? The reality is, right, sometimes there's just things we have to do. I think really pushing us to look at, is it something we have to do, right? And kind of who's saying we have to do it, right? Is there a false sense of urgency or is that real? But if real, I think, again, the biggest thing is really just that communication piece and kind of following that even more to the letter of talking about what's not changing, what is, and then being honest, right, about what we don't know or about the challenge that we're facing there, right? Like, yes, this is not ideal, right, that we have to do these 2 things at once. For the next 3 months, we know it's going to overlap and it's going to be really stressful, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? After those 90 days, this one change should be finished. We'll only have the one to do. And then the celebration of the milestones is going to be really important for you there to make sure staff feel like progress is being made if there's kind of this sea of change happening all at once. Great question, though. Thank you. Other questions folks have before we wrap up here? I know we're right at time. All right, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. I'll send out slides and recordings shortly afterwards, and thank you all for joining.